Hey everyone, and welcome. Today, we're diving into a really compelling argument, one that comes entirely from within the Quran itself. It directly challenges a very common and very serious interpretation of Islamic scripture. We're going to explore whether the Quran actually calls for a death penalty for someone who leaves the faith. So let's jump right into the text. So let's put the big question right on the table. Based on the arguments presented in our source material, we're asking, does the foundational text of Islam truly command death for someone who decides to leave the religion? This is really the heart of the matter we're going to unpack today. Now, before we get into the verses, we have to acknowledge the elephant in the room. There's a very widespread interpretation out there that says, yes, leaving Islam is punishable by death. This idea is a major part of the conversation, so we're going to use it as our starting point and see how the Quranic verses themselves actually stack up against it. To really build this case, we're going to follow a clear 5-step roadmap. We'll start by defining what we're talking about. Then we'll uncover a pretty fascinating logical contradiction you can find right in the scripture. After that, we'll look at the Quran's core principle of no compulsion. Check out some historical scenarios from the text, and finally, we'll tie it all together with the relationship between freedom and faith. Okay, first things first, let's tackle that common misconception head on. And the best way to do that is to make sure we're all on the same page with our vocabulary. To really get into this argument, we have to be super clear about what our key term actually means. So, what is apostasy? Well, it's pretty simple. It's the act of renouncing one's religion. That's it. It's a straightforward definition, but it's the very action that's at the center of this huge life or death debate. And now we get to the real centerpiece of the argument from our source material. We're about to look at a specific verse in the Quran that describes this cycle, a cycle of believing and disbelieving. And the source argues that right here in this cycle lies a powerful logical contradiction. Okay, pay really close attention to the sequence of events being described in this verse from chapter 4. It outlines a very specific back-and-forth journey. It's not a one-way street from belief to disbelief. It's more complicated than that. All right, let's break this down. Step 1, a person believes. Step 2, they disbelieve. That's apostasy. Step 3, they believe again. And here it is. This is the logical key the source points to. If the punishment for step 2, disbelieving, was death, how on earth could a person ever get to step 3? It's physically impossible. The verse itself describes a scenario that couldn't happen if apostasy was a capital crime. And, this isn't just a one-off example. This verse from chapter 3 also talks about a people who have rejected after believing. So again, the Quran is presenting a situation where people have left the faith and are still around. It just reinforces that logical puzzle we just looked at. So, moving beyond that one specific logical contradiction, the source argues that the Quran lays out a much broader, more fundamental principle. This isn't just about one verse. It's about the entire nature of what faith is and the role of free will. And this verse right here from chapter 2 is maybe the most direct statement you can find on the topic. It says it, plain as day, let there be no compulsion in religion. Our source presents this as the absolute cornerstone of the argument. You can't force real faith. By its very nature, it has to be a choice. This slide really brings the point home, doesn't it? It shows the contrast between God's will and human force. The Quran is asking a really powerful question here. The argument is, if God, who could have easily made every person on earth a believer, chose not to, then what gives any human the right to try and force what God himself left as a choice? Building on that core principle, the source then points to specific historical moments right there in the Quran. You can think of these as little case studies showing how this idea of no compulsion actually plays out in situations described in the text. This one is fascinating. Verse 372 describes a strategy, a plot. A group plans to pretend to convert in the morning and then very publicly leave the faith by evening, all to create doubt among the real believers. Now, just ask yourself, like the source does, what kind of a plan is that if leaving the faith means you're executed on the spot? The whole plot is completely nonsensical. Our source also zooms in on this passage from chapter 4, which deals with apostates during a time of war. The divine instruction given to the believers isn't to execute them. No, it's to offer peace if they ask for peace. An instruction to negotiate peace is a world away from a mandatory, non-negotiable death sentence. And this right here is a crucial point that ties it all together. The source highlights that the Quran itself, in verse 16:106, says that any faith declared when you're being forced is invalid anyway. This sets up the ultimate paradox. What is the point of threatening someone with death to force them to believe, if the very act of forcing them makes their belief meaningless in God's eyes? So we've walked through all this textual analysis, but what's the bottom line? Why does any of this matter? In our last section, we're going to explore why the source argues this interpretation is so incredibly important, not just as a theological point, but for the actual health and well-being of a community. According to this source, the consequences of forcing belief are just devastating. It argues that when you suppress freedom of belief, you don't get a truly faithful society. Instead, you get a community full of hypocrites. You create resentment, and ultimately, you weaken the genuine strength of faith, leading to a fragile, weak system. And that brings us to the final, powerful idea from our source material, the thought that really frames this whole discussion. It's not just about getting the scripture right, it's about the foundation of society itself. As it says, freedom of belief is the air that healthy and just communities breathe. And so, we'll end by leaving you with a question to think about. Forget for a moment about this specific text or tradition. Just think, how does the way any community chooses to interpret its foundational scriptures end up shaping its most basic values about justice, freedom, and human dignity? Thanks for joining us.